I think growing up, of course, in the Protestant tradition, you'll call it communion, right? And growing up to just see it go, okay, well, it's that time of the month again. It's the first Sunday, right? So we're going to do
Yeah.
communion, and it becomes kind of just this. Okay, it's the first Sunday, and reading the early church fathers and the early church and how everything's centered around the Eucharist, right?
Yeah.
Even the Romans were saying, "Hey, these are cannibals, right? They're taking the blood of this Jesus guy. They're taking the body of this Jesus guy. They're eating his body," and to get slandered in that way, but in how central it was, right? How remembering what Jesus has done so central every time they fellowshipped. What has been your understanding of the Eucharist now? Growing up Baptist, non-denominational. What's the difference between then and now in your understanding of the Eucharist now or communion now
I love
versus
that question.
versus
Yeah.
before? Yeah. Welcome to the Revo Report. We're inspiring faith with reason and reason with faith.
So there was a time before I was probably uh, a young adult, back when I was a
Mm,
kid, I thought of the Lord's Supper as merely a symbol that it was a ritual that we did occasionally. And I didn't really even understand what we were doing other than sort of reenacting something from the Bible. And that was it, where Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood." But to me, it was just a symbol. It was symbolic that Jesus loved us. Um, and yet there was so much more. And, during a particular period of my life in my early 20s, I was attending a house church. And it was mostly people who were disaffiliated from evangelical churches that had decided we were just going to do church in our house. And yet, so often, the conversation within those house church meetings would go from attempts at worship to more just talking about what we were stressed about in current events or political topics or that whatever. And it would all be done as
yeah.
sort of a prayer request, quote unquote. But it would turn into just people talking about how stressed they are about current events.
Right.
And something was missing, and I think everybody knew it.
Mm.
So we came across this particular book that was self-published. It was just a very small. I don't know if there's even a way to find it, but this particular book was just basically encouraging house churches to have a renewed appreciation for the Lord's Supper.
Mm.
And this is way out of my Anglican context that I have today. So there's a lot of things here that I wouldn't say, yeah, just adopt that, and that's what I would recommend. But, God in his grace, he meets us exactly where we are.
Yeah.
And he brings us along on a journey and
Yes.
doesn't, abandon us until we can get it right. So, God met us in this place where we're all meeting in a house church, and he encourages us through this teaching about the Lord's Supper. The teaching was that the early church would meet, and the reason for their meeting, more than anything, was to partake in the Lord's Supper. And the Lord's Supper is more than just a symbol, but it's a place where Christ, in a very real and present way, meets with us, and we are bound together in him by participating in this holy moment, this Lord's Supper, or as in the Greek, it's called the Eucharist. The Thanksgiving feast is what Eucharist means.
Yeah.
And so what we started to do was just said, okay, this is what's clearly in the New Testament. The book, made that clear to us. We're just going to start doing this. So every week we would partake in the Lord's Supper, and we weren't doing it, according to the Book of Common Prayer or what any denomination would say is the correct way to do it. Not any way I would recommend us do it. But we were making these small steps toward obedience. And what we found was, as we participated in the Lord's Supper, all of our talk of anxiety and fear that was so present, it took a backstage to the fact that Christ was really present with us. And we were bound together in love and dependence upon each other in ways that I had never seen before. It was so profound that it was clear that it was God who was at work. We were setting aside our time and our resources for each other, not out of a sense of obligation, but just out of the joy that comes in being able to serve each other in the Lord.
Yeah.
And it only really started when we started meeting around the Lord's Supper. So that was around the same time I was starting to dig into church history. And I
Uh-huh.
was seeing this theme of, oh, yeah, through the centuries, the church has understood that the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, this is why the church gathers together. And this is the way that Jesus is showing us his love and the
Mhm.
way he's binding us together through the word, through the table. Like it's the word and the table. And
Mhm.
before we were just the word, there was no table, but they
Mm.
were both interlocked in our worship. The word and table. The word points to the table points to the word, and together, we are experiencing the real presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. And so, as I dug deeply into that, I was holding in hand one, the beauty of my evangelical experience with the gospel of knowing that Christ is mine and I am his, and also this Catholic understanding
Mm.
that the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, is the most important part of the Christian life. And so that kind of helped lead me ultimately to where I am today, where as an Anglican, we hold both of those things together. Um, and so it's so beautiful now. As in an Anglican service, we have a Eucharist service in the Book of Common Prayer that has its roots all the way back in some of the earliest liturgies of the church. So I'm now every week reenacting not just the beautiful things that God showed me as a young man in the house church, but also linking that into something so much bigger than just my individual experience or interpretation. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's also in a sense it's I feel like it's been hijacked as well, because
Uh-huh.
there
Yeah.
is another kind of hyper grace movement who's saying, "Hey, take of communion every day. Partake of the body every day, and your body will be healthy, and you will see financial breakthrough." And it's kind of been hijacked also in a way.
Yes.
And I've heard people actually come up to me and say, "Hey, you got to do communion every day because then your body's going to be healthy. You're going to stay young for a long time, and you're going to see financial breakthrough and all this stuff." Um, I don't know if have you run into that as well, by any chance? Just out of
Uh, I,
curiosity.
I have encountered that
Okay.
not a lot, but
Okay.
we're all in different corners of the Christian world, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can see how that could happen
Mm.
because just as the prosperity gospel distorts so many things, uh, it can turn something like the Lord's Supper into, instead of a place where Jesus meets us and we are able to sit face to face with him, physically, experiencing his presence. uh, a prosperity gospel could turn it into like a talisman where you use it almost like a
Yeah.
good luck.
Mhm.
And with that, I think it is, you are handling profoundly holy things in a way that God did not intend, and that's a very fearful place to be, I would say. So, yeah, definitely
Yeah.
would discourage that kind of good luck charm approach to any of this because we're meeting God on His terms. We're not
Yes.
using God for our terms.